Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The sand beneath Marcus's fingers felt like broken glass, each grain a tiny blade slicing into his torn flesh. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale creating small clouds of crimson mist in the scorching air. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a vast ocean of amber and gold that shimmered with deadly beauty under the alien sun overhead. Behind him, smoke rose in twisted columns, the funeral pyre of his unit, his friends, his life. He had crawled for what felt like hours, maybe days. Time had lost all meaning when survival became the only thought that mattered. His uniform, once the proud blue of the Colonial Defense Force, now hung in tatters, stained with blood that was sometimes his own and sometimes not. The betrayal still echoed in his mind. Johnson's face twisted with greed, the flash of credits changing hands, the moment when their supposed allies had opened fire. The ruins ahead offered the only shade for miles. Ancient structures jutted from the sand like broken teeth, their surfaces covered in symbols that seemed to shift and dance in his heat-addled vision. This had been some kind of outpost once, though whether human or alien, he couldn't tell. The architecture was wrong somehow, angles that didn't quite make sense, doorways that seemed too tall and too narrow at the same time. Marcus collapsed against what might have been a wall, his body finally giving in to the inevitable. His water had run out 12 hours ago. His emergency beacon had been destroyed in the attack. No one was coming for him. The desert would claim him, just as it had claimed so many others who had dared to walk its burning expanse. That's when he heard them. Footsteps in the sand. Soft at first, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the ruins. Then closer, more deliberate. Marcus tried to raise his head, tried to reach for the sidearm that was no longer at his hip. His vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges, but he could make out a silhouette approaching. She emerged from the heat haze like something from a fever dream. Tall, easily 7 feet, with skin the color of sapphires touched by starlight. Her limbs were long and elegant, built for speed and grace, yet beneath that ethereal beauty lay the unmistakable strength of a warrior. Intricate patterns were etched into her skin, glowing faintly with their own inner light, telling stories he couldn't read but somehow understood, spoke of honor and loss. Her hair flowed like liquid mercury, silver strands that caught the light and threw it back in impossible ways. But it was her eyes that held him, amber pools that seemed to contain the wisdom of ages and the pain of countless battles. She wore the remnants of armor, sleek plates that had once covered her torso and limbs, now cracked and broken. Heavy chains hung from her wrists, the metal still warm from whatever forge had shaped them. She was wounded. Deep gashes ran along her left arm, and her breathing came in careful, measured intervals that spoke of cracked ribs and internal damage. Yet she moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step calculated and precise. "You," she said, and her voice was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, melodic and haunting. "You saved me once." Marcus tried to speak, tried to tell her she was mistaken, that he'd never seen her before in his life. The words came out as a croak, barely human. She knelt beside him and he could smell something like cinnamon and ozone, the scent of distant storms and foreign spices. Her hand touched his cheek, and her skin was cool against his fever-hot flesh. "I remember," she whispered, "when they took me from the battlefield. You were there, small, broken, but you tried to help." The memory stirred something deep in his mind, fragments of a half-remembered dream. A flash of blue skin, screams, the crack of energy weapons, but it slipped away like smoke, too fragmented to grasp. Behind her something moved in the shadows. A tail, he realized, long and serpentine, covered in scales that pulsed with the same inner light as the patterns on her skin. It swayed hypnotically, almost alive with its own intelligence. "You're dying," she said matter-of-factly, tilting her head as she studied his face. "The desert has already begun to claim you. I can smell death on your breath." Marcus managed a nod. He could feel it too, the cold creeping up from his extremities, the way his heartbeat had become irregular and weak. "I can save you," she continued, her amber eyes never leaving his face. "But you must understand, you will live, but not as yourself." Her tail rose above them both, the tip glowing with an intense blue-white radiance that made the air shimmer and dance. I am Kithara, daughter of the Wind Riders, last of the Skyborn clan. My people are dead. My world burns. But my essence... She paused, her expression growing distant. My essence can live on. What ... Marcus croaked, barely managing the single word. I will share my spirit with you, she said. My memories, my strength, my pain. You will be yourself, but you will also be me. Two souls in one vessel, two lives intertwined. Her tail moved closer to his throat, the light growing brighter. The choice is yours, human. Die here as Marcus Chen, or live as something new. Through his delirium, Marcus thought of the smoking ruins behind him, of the friends whose bodies were already being claimed by scavengers. He thought of the betrayal that had led them all to this place, of the emptiness that awaited him in death. What did it matter what he became, if he could simply continue to exist? He nodded. Kithara placed her tail against his throat, and the world exploded in light. The tail's touch was ice and fire, tearing him apart atom by atom. Marcus's vision exploded, white-hot fragments of memory that weren't his own stabbing through his skull like glass shards. Purple skies, floating cities crumbling into flame. A woman's face, Kithara's mother, mouth open in a silent scream as metal locusts devoured the horizon. The taste of blood and starlight on his tongue as something alien and vast poured into his mind like molten metal. Her pain hit him like a physical blow. Every death, every chain, every needle that had pierced her flesh in sterile rooms where they dissected her people like insects. The agony was so pure it made him convulse, back arching as her rage flooded his nervous system. Something feminine and furious clawed its way into his consciousness, rewriting neural pathways, claiming territory. Marcus felt himself dissolving, his identity fragmenting as an alien will wrapped around his thoughts like strangling vines. Then darkness took him, and Marcus Chen died in a flash of alien light. When consciousness returned, it came with violence. Marcus screamed as two sets of memories crashed together like colliding stars. His back arched as alien thoughts carved themselves into his brain with surgical precision. Not his thoughts, her thoughts. Kithara's voice whispered in languages that made his throat burn, speaking words about wind riding and sky songs that had no meaning, but felt more real than his own name. Get out, he gasped, clawing at his skull. Get out of my head. But the voice only laughed. His voice. But the harmony was wrong, layered with impossible undertones. His hands moved without permission, tracing patterns in the sand that he'd never learned, but somehow knew by heart. Clan markings, death rites, symbols that meant home in a language Earth had never spoken. Marcus tried to stand and found his body moving with fluid grace that wasn't his own. Every gesture carried the unconscious poise of someone who'd spent lifetimes dancing between floating spires. His human muscle memory screamed in protest, but his limbs obeyed older commands now. He tried to speak, to call out into the emptiness of the ruins, and froze at the sound that emerged from his throat. His voice was still recognizably his own, but layered now with harmonics that hadn't been there before. It was softer, more melodious, carrying undertones that seemed to echo from somewhere else entirely. What have you done to me? He whispered, and even the whisper sang. A piece of broken metal nearby reflected his image back at him, and Marcus scrambled toward it on hands and knees. The face that stared back was not his face. For one terrifying moment, Kithara looked back at him from the reflection. Her angular features, her silver hair, her expression of ancient sorrow. Then he blinked, and it was his own face again, but wrong. The same stubborn jaw, the same scar from temple to cheek, but the eyes. His eyes had been brown. These eyes were amber, shot through with flecks of gold that seemed to move with their own inner fire. As he watched, his reflection smiled, but he wasn't smiling. The alien expression lasted only a second before his own horror reasserted control. No, he whispered, and even his whisper sang with harmonics that belonged to another throat. No, no, no. He pressed his hands against the glass, watching his fingers trace symbols he didn't recognize. Behind his reflection, he could swear he saw another figure, tall, blue-skinned, watching him with those same amber eyes. But when he spun around, only empty ruins greeted him. Marcus reached up to touch his throat and felt it. A mark burned into his skin, still warm to the touch. The symbol was intricate, composed of flowing lines that seemed to spell out words in a script he didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was a clan marking he knew without knowing how. The sign of the Skyborn, the last remnant of a people who had danced among the clouds of a world that no longer existed. The ruins around him looked different now. No longer random piles of weathered stone, but clearly the remains of a way station, a place where travelers had once stopped to rest and resupply on their journeys across the desert. He could see the layout as if it were still intact. The main hall where strangers had shared meals and stories, the sleeping chambers where they had found shelter from the storms, the communication array that had once connected this isolated outpost to the broader network of civilization. How did he know these things? The knowledge felt foreign yet familiar, like remembering a dream from childhood. Every detail was crystal clear in his mind, yet he was certain he had never been here before in his life. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, marveling at the ease of the motion. His injuries, the cuts and burns and deep exhaustion that had been killing him, were gone. Not healed exactly, but transformed somehow, absorbed into something larger and more resilient. He felt strong, stronger than he ever had as a human, with an energy that thrummed through his bones like electricity. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of crimson and gold. By all rights, he should have been thinking about shelter, about water, about the long journey back to civilization. Instead, he found himself drawn to climb the tallest of the ruined structures, scaling the broken wall with an agility that would have been impossible for him just hours before. From the top, he could see for miles in every direction. The desert stretched away in rolling dunes and scattered stone formations, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. But now he could see patterns in the landscape that had been invisible before, subtle signs that spoke of ancient roadways and buried settlements. The desert was not empty. It was sleeping, waiting for someone who knew how to read its secrets. In the distance, a line of lights moved across the sand, a convoy of some kind, heading roughly in his direction. Marcus felt a moment of hope, rescue at last, but it was immediately tempered by something else, a caution that felt distinctly foreign. Kethera's instincts, he realized, her memories of betrayal and chains and experiments conducted in sterile rooms by beings who saw her as nothing more than an interesting specimen. He climbed down from his perch and began walking toward the approaching lights, his pace unhurried but purposeful. As he walked, fragments of memory continued to surface. Not his own memories, but hers. The taste of food from her homeworld, tart and sweet and unlike anything that had ever grown on Earth. The sensation of flight, of soaring through purple skies on wings of living energy. The songs her people sang to guide their children to sleep. Melodies that spoke of wind and freedom and the dance of the stars. But also darker memories. The day the invaders came with their ships like metal storms. The battle that had raged across her world's sky. Her people fighting with desperate courage against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. The moment when she had been struck down, wounded and alone, watching her civilization burn from the deck of a capture vessel. The pain of those memories was overwhelming, grief so intense it brought tears to his eyes. Yet there was something else mixed in with the sorrow, a fierce pride, an unbreakable spirit that had survived even when everything else had been lost. Kethera had been a warrior of the Skyborn, and no amount of suffering could change that fundamental truth. The convoy turned out to be a patrol from the Meridian base, 3 heavily armored vehicles bristling with sensors and weapons. They stopped when their headlights picked him out of the darkness, a lone figure walking across the empty desert. Soldiers emerged, their weapons trained on him, but not yet threatening. "Hold it right there," called the squad leader, a weathered sergeant with the kind of scars that came from too many combat zones. "Identify yourself." Marcus stopped, raising his hands to show they were empty. Sergeant Marcus Chen, Colonial Defense Force, service number 7749-Delta-9. The words came automatically, but even as he spoke them, they felt wrong somehow, like a coat that no longer fit properly. The soldiers exchanged glances, and Marcus could see confusion in their body language. The sergeant activated a hand scanner, pointing it in his direction. The device beeped several times, then emitted a harsh, buzzing sound. "That's impossible," muttered one of the younger soldiers. "Chen's been dead for 3 days. We found his tags at the ambush site. I'm not dead, Marcus said, and even he could hear the strange harmonics in his voice, the layered quality that made it sound like two people speaking at once. The sergeant stepped closer, studying Marcus's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. You look like Chen, he admitted, but there's something... He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. What happened to your eyes, soldier? Marcus had no answer for that, at least none that would make sense to these men. How could he explain that he carried the soul of an alien warrior inside him? That her memories and instincts were bleeding into his own consciousness like water soaking through paper? How could he tell them that he was no longer entirely human? I was injured, he said finally. Things are still a little confused. The sergeant wasn't buying it. He gestured to his men, and they moved to surround Marcus, their weapons shifting from ready to aimed. On your knees, hands behind your head. Something's not right here. Marcus complied, but every instinct, both his own and Cathara's, screamed warnings. These men were dangerous, not because of their weapons, but because they represented the same forces that had taken her people captive, that had turned warriors into test subjects and civilizations into resource extraction sites. The colonial defense force that Marcus had served faithfully for 8 years suddenly felt like the enemy. One of the soldiers produced a pair of restraint cuffs, the kind designed to hold even augmented humans. As they closed around his wrists, Marcus felt something shift inside his mind. Cathara's memories of chains and captivity rose to the surface, bringing with them a rage so pure and clean it was like drinking fire. Wait, the sergeant said, playing his flashlight across Marcus's neck. What the hell is that? The beam illuminated the clan marking, and Marcus could see the way it pulsed with its own inner light, responding to his emotional state. The soldiers backed away instinctively, weapons raised. Some kind of parasite, suggested the younger soldier. Maybe that's what's scrambling the bioscanner. Or a control device, the sergeant said grimly. Something the aliens used to turn our own people against us. He keyed his radio. Command, this is Patrol 7. We've got a possible compromised asset. Requesting immediate extraction and containment protocols. The response crackled back almost immediately. Copy Patrol 7. Secure the subject and bring him in for analysis. Use extreme caution. Assume hostile infiltration. Marcus felt his heart sink. They weren't going to help him. They were going to treat him like a weapon, something to be studied and dissected until they understood how it worked. Cathara's memories provided him with vivid images of what that would entail. Sterile rooms and cold metal tables, and the endless succession of tests and procedures that had slowly stripped away everything that made her people who they were. He tried to remain calm to convince himself that these were his own people, soldiers he had served alongside for years. But when the sergeant moved closer with some kind of scanning device, something inside Marcus snapped. The restraints shattered like glass. Marcus didn't consciously decide to break free. It simply happened, as natural as breathing. One moment he was kneeling in the sand with his hands cuffed behind his back. The next he was standing upright with fragments of metal and polymer scattered around his feet. His strength was incredible, far beyond anything merely human. The soldiers opened fire immediately, but Marcus was no longer where their weapons were aimed. He moved like liquid lightning, flowing around their shots with an inhuman grace that spoke of reflexes honed on alien battlefields. His body seemed to know exactly how to bend and twist to avoid the energy bolts, as if he had been dodging such weapons all his life. One soldier screamed as Marcus's hand closed around his throat, not crushing, but applying just enough pressure to render him unconscious. The others barely had time to register their teammates' fall before they too were down, dropped by precise strikes that left them breathing but motionless. Marcus stood in the center of the scattered soldiers, breathing hard and staring at his hands in horror. He hadn't wanted to hurt them. They were his own people, fellow humans who were just doing their jobs. But when they had moved to restrain him, to take him away for experimentation, Cathara's instincts had taken over completely. The sergeant was still conscious, though a growing bruise on his jaw showed where Marcus had struck him. His eyes were wide with terror and confusion as he stared up at the man he thought he knew. "What are you?" he whispered. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because he honestly didn't know anymore. Instead, he turned and walked away into the desert, leaving the patrol behind with their unconscious comrades and their unanswered questions. As he walked, he felt Cathara's presence more strongly than ever. her memories and emotions flowing through his consciousness like a river in flood. She had been proud once, a warrior of a people who rode the wind itself and sang battle songs that could shatter mountains. She had been captured, chained, experimented upon by beings who saw her as nothing more than an interesting biological specimen, and she had endured, keeping her spirit intact even as they stripped away everything else she valued. Now that spirit was his, merged with his own identity in ways he was only beginning to understand. He was still Marcus Chen, but he was also something more, or perhaps something less. The distinction was becoming increasingly meaningless. The night passed in a blur of walking and unwanted memory. Every step brought new fragments of Kithara's life bubbling to the surface. He learned their language through direct experience, as if remembering words he'd spoken all his life. But with the memories came deeper changes. Marcus found himself craving foods he'd never heard of, jerking away from sounds that held no threat for a human. His body language shifted without conscious control, taking on fluid grace that belonged to windriders and sky dancers. When he tried to eat his emergency rations, his hands moved in ritual patterns, breaking the food into 7 pieces, arranging them in star shapes, whispering blessing words in a language that made his teeth ache. He caught himself doing it and threw the food across the sand in disgust. "Stop it!" he shouted at the empty desert. "Those aren't my hands." But even his anger moved wrong, his fists clenching in positions designed for weapons he'd never held, his stance shifting into combat forms that had been perfected on alien battlefields. He was fighting a war with his own body and losing. Most disturbing of all, he began to dream her dreams, not just memories of her past life, but the dreams she had woven during her captivity, visions of vengeance and freedom that had kept her sane through the endless cycle of imprisonment and experimentation. In those dreams, she was hunting the ones who had destroyed her people, moving through the darkness like an avenging angel with fire in her veins and death in her hands. When he woke from such dreams, Marcus could taste blood in his mouth and feel his fingers curled as if around an enemy's throat. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating, a reminder that he now carried within himself the concentrated fury of an entire extinct civilization. It was during one such dream that he first heard her voice as something separate from his own thoughts. He was reliving the destruction of her homeworld, watching from orbit as the invaders' weapons turned the floating cities into falling stars. In the dream, Kethara stood beside him, her amber eyes reflecting the fires below. "They must pay," she said, her voice like wind through broken glass. "Every one of them must pay for what they took from us." "But you're dead," Marcus replied, surprised to find himself speaking in the dream. "Your people are gone." "Are they?" Kithara turned to look at him, and he saw that half of her face was his own. "You carry us now, our memories, our pain, our purpose." She placed a hand over his heart, and he felt warmth spread through his chest. "As long as you live, the Skyborn are not truly extinct." "I don't know how to be you," Marcus said. "You don't have to be me," she replied. "You just have to choose to live, to remember, to make them pay." Marcus woke with tears on his cheeks and the taste of cosmic wind in his mouth. The dream had felt more real than reality, a glimpse into a world that existed only in his merged consciousness. But the emotions it had stirred were entirely his own. Grief for people he had never met, anger at injustices he had never suffered, a burning need for vengeance that felt both foreign and absolutely right. The sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him painfully of his homeworld's final moments. Marcus stood and continued walking, no longer entirely certain where he was going, but drawn by instincts that felt both ancient and immediate. It was near midday when he first caught the scent that made his heart race and his muscles tense with anticipation. It was subtle at first, barely detectable even with his enhanced senses, a mixture of metal and ozone, and something that might have been fear sweat. But as he crested a low ridge, the smell grew stronger, and with it came the sound of voices speaking in a language that made his teeth ache. Below him, partially hidden by a cluster of wind-carved rock formations, was a camp. Not human. That much was immediately clear from the architecture of the temporary structures and the way they seemed to bend light around themselves in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The inhabitants moved with the predatory grace of apex predators, their forms tall and angular and wrong in ways that suggested they had evolved under a different gravity than Earth's. Marcus felt his lip curl back in what was definitely not a human expression. These were them, the invaders who had come to Kethera's world like a plague of living metal, who had turned her people's floating cities into falling stars, and her clanmates into experimental subjects. Through his merged memories, he could see their ships raining fire from orbit, could hear the death songs of the Skyborn as they fell one by one before weapons that turned matter itself against its wielders. The rage that filled him was volcanic in its intensity, a fury so pure and clean it was almost intoxicating. Every instinct he possessed, both human and alien, screamed at him to attack, to fall upon the camp like a force of nature, and tear his enemies apart with his bare hands. But beneath the bloodlust was something else, a calculating coldness that spoke of patience and planning. Kethera had been more than just a warrior. She had been a strategist, a leader who had guided her people through countless conflicts before the final apocalypse. Her tactical knowledge flowed through Marcus's mind like water, showing him not just how to kill his enemies, but how to make their deaths meaningful. He spent the rest of the day observing the camp, learning its rhythms and patterns. The invaders, he found he could not think of them by any other name, maintained strict schedules, their activities governed by protocols that spoke of military discipline and technological superiority. They had sentries, of course, but they relied heavily on their scanners and detection grids, trusting their superior technology to provide early warning of any threats. They had not considered the possibility of a threat that was both human and alien, something that could slip through their sensors by presenting the wrong kind of biosignature. Marcus moved through their detection net like a ghost, invisible to devices that were designed to identify specific species rather than unique hybrid entities. As the sun set and the camp settled into its nighttime routine, Marcus began to move closer. His approach was patient and methodical, guided by knowledge that felt both inherited and earned. He knew exactly where to step to avoid the pressure sensors buried in the sand, exactly how to move to stay in the shadows cast by their defensive structures. The first sentry's neck snapped with a wet crack. Marcus caught the body before it hit the ground, the alien's eyes still blinking in confusion as life faded from them. Strange blue fluid leaked from its mouth, glowing faintly in the darkness. The second sentry turned just as Marcus's hand punched through its chest cavity. Ribs shattered like brittle plastic. The creature's scream cut off in a gurgle as Marcus's fingers found something that might have been a heart and crushed it to pulp. When the alarm triggered, Marcus moved like liquid death through the camp. Bodies fell around him, some missing heads, others folded at impossible angles. Alien blood painted the sand in luminescent streaks. The creatures that had destroyed Kethera's world died like the vermin they were, their superior technology useless against something that moved with the fury of an extinct civilization. Marcus stood among the carnage, his hands dripping with fluids that glowed like dying stars. The smell of ozone and burnt metal filled his nostrils. Around him, emergency lights cast everything in hellish red, turning the massacre into something from a fever dream. The rage that had driven him was slowly fading, replaced by a hollowness that felt like the echo of old grief. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked the darkness, not sure if he was addressing Kethera or himself. For a moment there was no answer. Then, soft as a whisper of wind through broken glass, he heard her voice. "It's a beginning." Marcus spent the next hour going through the camp systematically, gathering intelligence and supplies. The invaders' technology was sophisticated, but much of it was keyed to specific genetic signatures and would be useless to him. Still, there were universal tools, weapons, communicators, navigation devices that he could adapt to his needs. More importantly, he found records, data crystals that contained mission logs, tactical assessments, and most crucially, the locations of other camps and installations. The invaders were not here by accident. They were part of a larger operation, one that had been years in the planning and execution. As Marcus studied the captured data, a clearer picture began to emerge. The alien force was not trying to conquer Earth in any traditional sense. Instead, they were conducting what appeared to be a systematic harvesting operation, gathering specific resources and biological specimens for transport to some unknown destination. Humans were not their primary target. They were simply another resource to be cataloged and collected. The implications made his blood run cold. This was exactly what they had done to Kethera's people. Not conquered them, but harvested them, reducing a proud civilization to a collection of genetic material and cultural artifacts. Earth was just the latest stop in a campaign that had already consumed dozens of worlds across the galaxy. But this time, they had made a mistake. They had left behind a survivor, not just of their latest atrocity, but of one of their earlier campaigns. And that survivor now wore human skin and carried human tactical knowledge, making her far more dangerous than they could possibly anticipate. Marcus gathered what supplies he could carry and set fire to the rest of the camp. As the flames rose into the night sky, he felt a moment of savage satisfaction that was definitely not entirely his own. The invaders had come to his world expecting easy prey, another helpless civilization to be processed and packaged for distant markets. Instead, they had awakened something that had been sleeping in the deep places between stars, the concentrated fury of the dispossessed, the unquenchable thirst for justice that burned in the hearts of the conquered. Kethora's people might be gone, but their spirit lived on, and it was very, very angry. Marcus walked away from the burning camp and into the desert night, following star patterns that looked strange to human eyes but felt like home to something deeper. Behind him, smoke rose toward the alien constellations, carrying with it the scent of vengeance and the promise of more fires to come. The days that followed blurred together. Marcus moved across the desert like a man possessed, which in a very real sense he was. Each step carried him further from his old life and deeper into something that felt both foreign and familiar. He avoided human settlements, the risk of contact too great. The changes were accelerating. His consciousness shifted and evolved in ways that left him feeling like a stranger in his own skin. He was becoming something else entirely. It was on the fourth day that he encountered others of Kethora's people. The settlement appeared without warning, rising from the desert sands like something from a fever dream. One moment Marcus was walking across empty dunes. The next he was standing at the edge of what could only be described as organized chaos. Structures that seemed to be grown, rather than built, twisted up from the sand in impossible spirals and curves, their surfaces shimmering with the same inner light he had seen in Kethora's markings. The inhabitants were obviously not human, though they shared enough characteristics with Kethora to make their common origin clear. They were tall and graceful, with skin that ranged from deep blue to silvery white, and all of them bore the intricate clan markings that told the stories of their lives and lineages. But where Kethora had carried herself with the proud bearing of a warrior, these people moved with the careful precision of those who had learned to live in the shadows. They had detected his approach long before he saw their settlement. Marcus found himself surrounded by 24 figures who had emerged from the sand itself. Weapons trained on him, but not yet hostile. Their eyes, all amber, all ancient, studied him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You carry the scent of the Skyborn," said their leader, a female whose markings glowed with particular intensity. "But you are not of our people. What are you?" Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but what came out was not his voice. Instead, he heard himself speaking in Kethora's tongue, words flowing with a fluidity that surprised him. "I am Arisha," he said, using a word that felt both strange and perfectly natural. "I carry the spirit of Kethora, daughter of the Wind Riders, last of the Skyborn clan." The effect on the assembled figures was immediate and dramatic. Weapons were lowered, heads bowed, and several of the younger ones actually took a step backward in what looked like religious awe. "Impossible," whispered the leader. "She is dead. We felt her passing on the cosmic wind." "She died," Marcus agreed, still speaking in that melodious alien tongue. "But her spirit lives, in me, through me. Her memories are my memories. Her pain is my pain. Her purpose, ... He paused, feeling the weight of that unfinished sentence. "Her purpose is my purpose." The leader approached slowly, her movements careful and respectful. "Show us," she said. "Prove that you carry her essence." Marcus didn't hesitate. Without conscious thought, he began to sing, but the voice that emerged wasn't his. The melody poured from his throat like liquid mercury, words in a language that felt right on his tongue, but wrong in his mind. Each syllable tasted of cosmic dust and ancient grief, and with every note, he felt more of himself slipping away. His clan marking blazed like a brand, and he could feel his human memories growing dim, fading like photographs left in the sun. What was his mother's name? Had he ever had a mother? The faces of his squad mates blurred and shifted, becoming blue-skinned strangers with amber eyes. Terror clawed at his chest. He was disappearing, dissolving into something else entirely. By the time the song ended, would Marcus Chen still exist at all? As the assembled figures knelt before him, Marcus wanted to scream. They saw Cathara reborn, but he felt like a man drowning in someone else's soul, fighting for air that would never come. Arezha, the leader said, and her voice carried a reverence that made Marcus uncomfortable. The twice-lived, we welcome you to our hidden sanctuary. The settlement was larger than it had appeared from the outside, extending deep underground through a network of tunnels and chambers that had been carved from the living rock. The architecture was alien but beautiful, all flowing curves and organic shapes that seemed to grow from the stone itself. Bioluminescent organisms provided light, their soft glow creating pools of color that shifted and danced with the movement of air through the tunnels. Marcus was given quarters befitting his apparent status. A large chamber with a view of the underground gardens, where impossible plants grew in carefully tended rows. The furniture was alien, but somehow familiar. Designs that his human body should have found uncomfortable, but that felt perfectly natural to sit in. It was there, in the quiet of his temporary home, that he finally had time to process what was happening to him. The confrontation with the invaders' camp had been a catalyst, accelerating changes that had been building since his transformation. He was no longer just Marcus Chen with some alien memories grafted onto his consciousness. He was becoming something genuinely new, a hybrid entity that was neither fully human nor fully skyborn. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. That evening, the settlement's leaders came to visit him. They brought food, strange delicacies that his human palate should have rejected, but that tasted like childhood memories and stories of their own exile. They were not skyborn, Marcus learned, but members of a dozen different species that had been harvested by the same invaders who had destroyed Cathara's people. Refugees and survivors, united by their common loss and their determination to resist. We have been waiting, explained the leader, who had introduced herself as Veltar of the Deep Current. The prophecies spoke of one who would carry the essence of the lost, who would become a bridge between what was and what could be. We hoped it was metaphor. It seems we were wrong. What do you expect from me? Marcus asked, and was relieved to find that his own voice was returning, though it still carried harmonics that hadn't been there before. Leadership, said another figure, this one male with markings that pulse like a slow heartbeat. You carry the memories of a dozen worlds, the tactical knowledge of the greatest warrior poets our people ever produced. More than that, you understand both the human way of war and our own traditions. You are uniquely qualified to unite the resistance. I'm one person, Marcus protested, and I'm only half alien at that. You are the twice-lived, Veltar said simply. That makes you something that has never existed before. The invaders have contingencies for dealing with humans and contingencies for dealing with our various species, but they have no contingencies for dealing with you. Over the following days, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what they were asking of him. The settlement was just one node in a network that stretched across the desert and beyond, connecting isolated communities of survivors and refugees who had been scattered by the invaders' harvesting operations. They had weapons, intelligence, and most importantly, they had hope, but they lacked coordination and leadership. The invaders were methodical in their approach, clearing each region systematically before moving on to the next. They had superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but they were also predictable, following patterns that had served them well on countless other worlds. That predictability was their weakness, if someone could be found who was capable of exploiting it. Marcus spent hours studying intelligence reports and tactical assessments, his merged consciousness processing information with an efficiency that surprised even him. Cathara's strategic knowledge combined with his own military training to create insights that neither human nor skyborn tacticians could have achieved alone. But it was during the long desert nights when the settlement slept and he walked among the underground gardens that he felt the deepest changes taking place. His body was adapting, becoming stronger and more resilient, while his senses sharpened to levels that bordered on supernatural. He could smell water from miles away, could feel the approach of sandstorms hours before they became visible, could navigate by star patterns that human astronomers had never catalogued. More disturbing were the emotional changes. The grief and rage that had initially driven him were evolving into something colder and more purposeful. He found himself thinking of humans, his own former species, with a detachment that was both alien and completely natural. They were still his people in one sense, but they were also just another intelligent species struggling to survive in a hostile galaxy. No more or less important than the Skyborn or the Deep Current or any of the other civilizations that had fallen to the invaders' systematic harvest. It was a dangerous way of thinking, he knew. The human part of his mind rebelled against such casual dehumanization, even as the alien aspects of his consciousness found it perfectly logical. He was becoming something new, but that evolution came with the risk of losing essential parts of what had made him who he was. The crisis came on the 7th night, when scouts brought word of a massive invader fleet moving toward the nearest human city. The intelligence reports were clear. This was not a harvesting operation, but something far worse. The aliens had grown tired of the resistance they were encountering and had decided to eliminate the problem at its source. They mean to sterilize the entire region, Veltar explained as they studied the tactical displays. Every living thing within 1,000 miles will be reduced to its component atoms. Then they'll move on to the next population center. How long do we have? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. 48 hours at most, replied the scout who had brought the intelligence. Their advance elements are already in position. The main fleet will arrive at dawn the day after tomorrow. Marcus felt something shift inside his mind, a crystallization of purpose that was both terrifying and exhilarating. This was the moment Kythera had been preparing for throughout her captivity, the chance to strike back at the beings who had destroyed everything she had ever loved. But it was also the moment when Marcus Chen would either find a way to save his species or die in the attempt. Gather the clan leaders, he said, and his voice carried harmonics that made the assembled figures straighten with military precision. It's time to go to war. The next 24 hours passed in preparation and planning. Messages went out through the resistance network, calling in favors and mobilizing resources. Weapons were distributed, tactics explained, battle songs sung to prepare hearts and minds for what was to come. But not everyone was convinced. You bring death with you, said Telshan, a scarred warrior whose markings told stories of a dozen battles. He stood before the assembled fighters, his weapon trained not on the horizon, but on Arizha himself. I can smell it on you, the stench of the twice dead. You are not one of us. He carries Kythera's spirit, Veltar protested. He carries her corpse, Telshan spat. Look at him, human flesh wearing our sacred marks like a costume, an abomination that speaks with stolen voices and thinks with borrowed thoughts. Arizha felt Kythera's rage rising in his chest like fire. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his hand moving in a gesture that belonged to her people's ancient combat traditions. Energy crackled around his fingers, drawn from sources that existed beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. You dare, he began, but the words that emerged were Kythera's, filled with the authority of the Skyborn nobility. Telshan's eyes widened in genuine terror. He raised his weapon, but it was too late. The energy discharge hit him like a focused lightning bolt, and he collapsed, his body convulsing as alien power raced through his nervous system. When the convulsions stopped, Telshan was still breathing, but something had been burned out of his mind. He stared at Arizha with empty eyes, no longer capable of recognizing friend from foe. The assembled fighters backed away, their weapons half raised, uncertain whether they were looking at their salvation or their doom. A small voice broke the tension. Are you really her? Arizha looked down to see a child, barely old enough to have received her first clan markings, staring up at him with eyes that held no fear, only curious hope. Are you really Kythera? The girl asked again. My grandmother said she knew you, said you used to sing the star songs during the festivals. Arizha knelt beside the child, feeling his heart break in ways that belonged to both species. The little girl's face was so innocent, untouched by the horrors that had shaped both his lives. What's your name? He asked gently. Silana, she whispered. But everyone calls me Little Star. Little Star, he repeated, the words tasting like honey and sorrow. I remember someone else who was called that once. Long ago, on a world that sang with wind. The child's eyes widened. So you are her. Arizha paused, staring into those trusting amber eyes. How could he explain the impossible truth? I am the shadow of the one who saved me, he said finally. Her light lives in me, but I am not her. I am something new, something between. Silana considered this with the serious gravity that children brought to important questions. Will you sing the star songs for us, even if you're only her shadow? Erisa smiled, and for the first time since his transformation, it felt genuine. Yes, little star, I will sing. When the song ended, the assembled fighters were ready to follow him into battle, not because they understood what he was, but because they had seen him give a dead child's culture back to her, if only for a moment. That night, as the resistance made final preparations, Erisa found himself in the deepest sleep he'd experienced since the transformation. And in that sleep came a dream that chilled him to his core. He was fighting the invaders again, moving with impossible grace across a battlefield lit by dying stars. But he was watching himself fight, floating above the carnage like a ghost, seeing his own body dance between energy beams and crushing metal. The figure below moved with perfect precision, every strike calculated, every dodge timed to perfection. But the movements were entirely alien. This wasn't how Marcus Chen had learned to fight in human military academies. These were the combat forms of the Skyborn, passed down through generations of wind riders and cloud dancers. As he watched, horrified, the fighting figure raised its head and looked directly at him with amber eyes that held no recognition. When it smiled, it was Kithara's expression of grim satisfaction, worn on Marcus's face like a mask that had grown too tight. You're disappearing, the figure said in his voice, but with her intonations. Little by little, thought by thought. Soon there will be only her, wearing your skin like a comfortable coat. Erisa tried to scream, tried to dive back into his own body, but found himself fixed in place. He could only watch as the figure below continued its deadly dance, growing more alien with each passing moment. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him the settlement was quiet, his fellow fighters sleeping peacefully. But Erisa lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at his hands in the darkness and wondering which consciousness would wake up tomorrow. It was then that he heard her voice again, clearer than it had ever been before. You are afraid, Kithara observed, her presence so vivid that Marcus almost turned to look for her physical form. Of course I'm afraid, he replied, not caring if the nearby soldiers thought he was talking to himself. I'm about to lead a handful of refugees against a fleet that could crack planets. Fear is appropriate, she said, but not for the reasons you think. You are afraid of what you are becoming, not of what you might lose. Marcus considered that. Maybe. Does it matter? It matters because that fear is holding you back, Kithara said. You keep trying to be Marcus Chen with some alien memories. But Marcus Chen is dead. He died in the desert 7 days ago. You are something new, something that has never existed before. Until you accept that, you will never be able to achieve your full potential. And if I accept it, if I let go of what I was, then you will become what you are meant to be, she said. The bridge between worlds, the voice of the lost, the weapon that will break their perfect system. As the sun set on what might be the last day of human civilization, Marcus Chen made his choice. He stood before the assembled forces of the resistance, humans and aliens united in desperate purpose, and began to sing. It was not a human song or an alien one, but something new, a melody that wove together the battle hymns of a dozen worlds and the half-remembered lullabies of his own childhood. As he sang, his clan marking blazed with inner fire, and the markings of every alien warrior present began to resonate in response. The song spoke of loss and hope, of civilizations that had fallen and the spirits that lived on in memory. It told the story of the twice-loved, the bridge walker who carried the dead forward into a future that was yet to be written. And it promised that no matter what tomorrow might bring, the resistance would not go quietly into the dark. When the song ended, Marcus looked out at the faces surrounding him, human and alien alike, and saw his own determination reflected back at him. They were ready. Tomorrow we dance with death, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled forces. But tonight we are alive. Tonight we remember why we fight. And tonight we become something more than the sum of our parts. The battle that followed would be remembered in the songs of both species for generations to come. But that is a story for another time. For now it is enough to know that when the sun rose on the day of judgment, It rose on a figure that was neither fully human nor fully alien, but something entirely new, a living symbol of resistance and hope that the invaders had never encountered before. Marcus Chen was dead. In his place stood Aresha, the twice-lived, the bridge between worlds, and for the first time since the transformation began, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The battle began before dawn, with the alien fleet descending through the atmosphere like falling stars made of malevolent metal. Their ships were vast beyond human comprehension, kilometer-long behemoths that bent space around themselves and turned the sky into a canvas of geometric impossibilities. As they approached the planet's surface, they began broadcasting the same ultimatum they had used on countless other worlds: surrender and be harvested, or resist and be sterilized. Aresha, stood on a high ridge overlooking the valley where the main human settlement had been built, feeling the weight of two civilizations pressing down on his consciousness. Through Cathara's memories, he could see the exact same scene playing out on her homeworld, the moment when her people had realized that their ancient aerial cities would not protect them from this new kind of enemy. But this time would be different. The resistance had positioned itself carefully, using knowledge gleaned from the captured intelligence to predict the invaders' likely approach vectors and target priorities. Small teams of mixed human-alien fighters had been deployed throughout the region, each group armed with weapons that had been specifically modified to exploit the weaknesses in alien defensive systems. More importantly, they had a secret weapon that the invaders could not possibly have anticipated. Aresha himself, a living fusion of tactical knowledge and strategic insight that combined the best of both species' military traditions. The first phase of the battle went exactly as predicted. The alien ships deployed their standard harvesting arrays, massive constructs that descended from orbit like mechanical angels of death. Their sensors swept the area methodically, cataloging every life sign and energy signature, while their weapon systems prepared to begin the systematic sterilization process. They found nothing. The resistance fighters were hidden in locations that did not register as threats to alien detection systems, buried in sand that absorbed energy signatures, camouflaged among rock formations that created false readings, positioned in underground facilities that had been carved using techniques borrowed from a dozen different mining traditions. To the invader sensors, the region appeared to be empty except for the human settlement in the valley below. That was when Aresha gave the signal. The attack came from all directions at once. Resistance fighters emerging from concealment to strike at the harvesting arrays with weapons that had been designed specifically for this moment. Explosive charges detonated against shield generators. Projectile weapons fired rounds that were keyed to destabilize alien armor, and energy weapons that had been reverse-engineered from captured technology lashed out with fury that had been building for years. But the real surprise came when the alien fleet tried to respond to the ground-based assault. Their ships turned their weapons on the scattered resistance positions, expecting to find small groups of lightly armed insurgents who could be eliminated with minimal effort. Instead, they found Aresha. He had positioned himself at the nexus point of the valley's natural energy flows, a location that Cathara's people would have recognized as sacred, but that human scientists would have dismissed as geologically interesting. Standing there with his arms spread and his clan marking blazing like a miniature star, he began to sing again, not the battle hymns of the previous night, but something far older and more dangerous. It was a song of awakening, a melody that called to the deep forces that moved between the stars and asked them to remember what the invaders had taken. As his voice rose across the battlefield, the very air began to shimmer with potential energy, reality bending in ways that alien sensors were not designed to detect. The first alien ship to fire on his position discovered that its weapons had become useless. The energy bolts simply dispersed harmlessly in the space around Aresha, absorbed by forces that existed outside the normal electromagnetic spectrum. The second ship found that its navigation systems were showing impossible readings, as if the gravitational field of the planet itself had begun to shift and warp. By the time the alien fleet commanders realized what they were dealing with, it was too late. Aresha was not just singing, he was conducting a symphony of destruction that drew its power from sources the invaders had never learned to monitor or defend against. The grief of extinct civilizations, given voice. The fury of the dispossessed made manifest. The concentrated will of every species that had ever fallen to the invaders' systematic harvest, channeled through a single hybrid consciousness that existed at the intersection of multiple realities. One by one, the alien ships began to fall, not destroyed in any conventional sense, but rather transformed, their perfectly ordered systems becoming chaotic and unpredictable as they were exposed to forces that existed outside their designers' understanding of physics. Hulls that had been designed to withstand the pressure of stellar cores cracked like eggshells. Weapons that could vaporize continents misfired and consume their own power sources. Navigation computers that could plot courses across galactic distances began reporting that they were simultaneously in orbit around every star in the local cluster. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it was over, the valley was littered with the wreckage of ships that had once seemed invincible, their twisted remains serving as monuments to the power of unified resistance. Arisha stood in the center of it all, his voice finally falling silent as the last echoes of his impossible song faded into the morning air. Around him, human and alien fighters emerged from their hiding places to survey the destruction they had wrought, their faces showing a mixture of triumph and awe. But the cost had been enormous. Arisha could feel it in every cell of his hybrid body, the toll that channeling such vast forces had taken on his merged consciousness. He was still alive, still fundamentally himself, but something essential had been burned away in the process of becoming a conduit for cosmic vengeance. When the medics finally reached him, they found him collapsed but breathing, his clan marking dim but still pulsing. As they worked to stabilize him, he drifted between consciousness and memory, feeling her presence one final time. Not as a separate entity, but as part of his own soul. "Who are you now?" she asked, using his voice. Arisha opened amber eyes that held depths no single lifetime could account for, and smiled. "I don't know," he said, "but she didn't want to die alone. So now, I won't live alone." He placed a hand over his heart and felt two rhythms beating there. One human, one alien, both singing in harmony. The sound was beautiful and strange and utterly unique. "She saved me," he whispered. "By becoming me?" Word of the victory spread like wildfire. Other worlds began to resist with new hope. But for Arisha, survival felt more like a question than an answer. When he was strong enough to walk, he made his way to the surface and stood beneath alien stars. A group of resistance fighters waited for him there, humans and aliens united in their victory, but uncertain what to do with the weapon they had unleashed. "What do we call you now?" asked one of the human commanders, a woman whose eyes held equal measures of gratitude and fear. Arisha paused, the question hanging in the air like smoke. For a long moment, he stared at his own shadow cast by the alien constellations, but the shadow seemed wrong. Too tall, moving independently of his body. He could swear he saw two figures overlapping, neither quite real. "I have two names," he said finally, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "One I'm forgetting, the other?" He touched the clan marking on his neck, feeling its alien warmth. "The other isn't mine yet." The fighters exchanged glances, unsure whether they were looking at their savior or something else entirely. In the distance, something that might have been wind sang through the ruins in voices that sounded almost like laughter. Arisha began to walk into the desert, his footsteps light on sand that whispered secrets only he could hear. Behind him, the wreckage caught the setting sun's light. Ahead lay a future that belonged to neither species, but perhaps to something new. And in his wake, two shadows moved as one, never quite touching, never quite separate, dancing to music that played only in the spaces between heartbeats.